First came the sound, a thin, rising whistle cutting through the drone of the engines, and by the time a man on the ground understood what he was hearing, it was already too late. The aircraft was in its dive, nose down, closing at better than 400 miles an hour, 6 heavy machine guns waking along its wings. It pulled out low, climbed away, and was gone before the dust had settled. It left behind wrecked vehicles, broken men, and that sound, which the enemy learned to dread. They said the Japanese had a name for it. They called it whistling death. We will come back to that name, because the truth of it is stranger than the legend. But the fear was real. Across the Pacific, and later over the frozen ridgelines of Korea, this was the aircraft the fleet sent when the situation was desperate. When a position had to be held, a column had to be stopped, or a man on the ground had to be kept alive. And the version that did it best, the final and most refined of them all, was the F4U-4. Stay with us, and we will take you through everything, including the demanding sequence a pilot had to work through just to get this aircraft off the ground.
This is the F4U-4 Corsair. Ground.
It was the definitive form of one of the finest piston-engine fighters ever built, and one of the last American propeller warplanes to fight in 2 separate wars. It existed to fix a problem. By late 1944, the earlier Corsairs were fast and heavily armed, but they were losing their edge in climb and high-altitude performance against improving Japanese fighters and the mounting threat of the kamikaze. So, in September 1944, the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics ordered the aircraft rebuilt around a more powerful, water-injected engine. The re-engining was so thorough that it became a new mark. We have modeled the F4U-4 in intricate detail to showcase both the features that made it legendary and the flaws that shaped its reputation. In this video, we focus on the definitive production version, the F4U-4. To understand why the Navy re-engined a fighter that was already winning, you have to go back to the air war it was built to fight. In the first year of the Pacific War, the sky belonged to Japan. The Mitsubishi Zero was light, agile, and astonishingly maneuverable, and in a turning fight, it was death to the heavier Allied fighters sent against it. American pilots were warned, in a U.S. Army Air Force intelligence summary, to never attempt to dogfight the Zero. The answer was not to build a better turning fighter, it was to change the rules of the fight. The first Corsairs reached the Pacific in 1943, and they were built around a different idea entirely: speed, firepower, and a powerful engine. Rather than turn with the Zero, a Corsair pilot would dive on it, fire, and climb away, using energy and weight with the Japanese fighter used agility. The Zero traded armor and protection for lightness. The Corsair kept its armor, protected its fuel, and simply refused to fight on the enemy's terms. It worked, but an aircraft is never finished. As the war went on, Japanese fighters improved, and the fighting climbed higher. Then came the kamikaze, which demanded interceptors that could climb fast and reach altitude quickly to catch an incoming aircraft before it reached the fleet. The early Corsairs, for all their strengths, gave up performance in exactly those areas as they climbed. The Navy did not need a new fighter. It needed the Corsair to breathe better in thin air. The design goal was narrow and specific: recover the climb and the high-altitude power the earlier marks lacked, without throwing away everything that already worked. The Navy's engineers did not start from a blank sheet. They took the proven F4U-1D airframe and rebuilt it around the water-injected Pratt & Whitney R2800-18W Double Wasp, a more powerful version of the same engine family. A more powerful engine needed a larger, more efficient propeller to convert that power into thrust, and it needed more air, which meant revised cowling and intakes. Almost every physical change in the F4U-4 traces back to that single decision to fit a stronger engine. This is why the aircraft looks so familiar and yet performs so differently. It is the same Corsair, breathing harder. The result was the fastest climbing, highest flying Corsair yet, and one that could still carry a heavy load of bombs and rockets off a carrier deck. It was, in the plainest sense, the version the whole line had been working toward. Getting there was not smooth, and the Corsair's development was never smooth. First, a note on the record, because it is easy to get wrong. You will often see the F4U-4's first flight given as the 19th of April, 1944. That date belongs to the F4U-4X, a pair of modified F4U-1s used as flying testbeds for the new engine, not the true prototype. The actual experimental F4U-4 followed later that year, and deliveries of production aircraft began in early 1945. The deeper story goes back to the very beginning of the Corsair, and to a reputation it earned the hard way. The early Corsairs were difficult and dangerous to land, especially aboard a carrier. The long nose blocked the pilot's forward view on approach. The aircraft tended to bounce on touchdown. And it had a hidden aerodynamic flaw. The two wings did not stall at the same speed, so as the aircraft slowed to land, one wing could drop suddenly and roll the machine into the deck. The fixes were unglamorous and, for the most part, American. Engineers cured the uneven stall with a small metal stall strip on the leading edge of one wing, first tested, remarkably, as plain wooden blocks in late 1942 and early 1943. They reworked the tailwheel and the landing gear oleos to tame the bounce, and on an earlier mark, they raised the pilot's seat and fitted a more bulged canopy to improve the view. The Royal Navy, which flew Corsairs from its own carriers, contributed a technique rather than a part, a curved, continuously turning approach that kept the deck in sight past that long nose. But the aircraft that reached the carriers was made landable mostly by changes to the aircraft itself. Even so, in inexperienced hands, the Corsair remained a handful, and it acquired a grim nickname among trainees: the Ensign Eliminator. We will see why when we reach the engine. The point for now is that the F4U-4 was not a fresh start. It was the most developed version of an aircraft that had already been through fire, in every sense. The Corsair's fuselage was built from shaped aluminum formers, connected along their length by long stringers called longerons. Aluminum sheet up to 1/10 of an inch, 2.5 millimeters, thick covered the frame, except at the control surfaces, which were skinned in fabric to save weight. The result was strong and light. The shape changed along its length. Forward of the cockpit, the frame was roughly oval. Behind it, it tapered to a tear-shaped cross-section, and then to a cone toward the tail. The frame was divided into 4 sections: engine, forward, middle, and rear, with a fireproof bulkhead separating the engine from the pilot. Overall, the fuselage ran 33 feet 8 inches, 10.26 meters. The complete aircraft spanned 41 feet across the wings and stood 14 feet 9 inches tall. Empty, it weighed about 9,200 pounds, loaded for combat, roughly 12,400 pounds, and fully burdened, close to 14,700 pounds. That made it heavier than the Navy's other great carrier fighter, the F-6F Hellcat, and far heavier than the Zero it was designed to beat. Where the Zero shed weight to turn, the Corsair carried its weight to fight. The Corsair's most famous feature was born from a simple mechanical conflict. To use its powerful engine, the aircraft needed a very large propeller. A large propeller needs ground clearance, and clearance normally means long, heavy landing gear, which is exactly what a carrier aircraft cannot afford. The Corsair solved it with its shape. The wing left the fuselage angled sharply downward, at 23 degrees below horizontal, reaching its lowest point out where the landing gear attached, then turned upward again at 8.5 degrees for the outer folding sections. This is the inverted gull wing, the W shape that makes a Corsair unmistakable in silhouette. By dropping the wing to its lowest point at the gear, the design let the aircraft use short, sturdy landing legs and still swing that enormous propeller clear of the deck. It also met the fuselage at an angle close to ideal for airflow, cutting drag. The trade-off was real. The bent wing was more complex and heavier to build than a straight one. But the structure was immensely strong, cleared for maneuvers up to 11 times the force of gravity, and the outer panels folded upward to save space on a crowded carrier deck. The wing roots did more than carry the aircraft. They housed large air intakes, feeding the oil coolers and the engine's supercharger, both essential to making that big radial perform at speed and altitude. And here is where the legend begins. At certain speeds, and especially in a dive, air rushing through those intakes produced a distinctive, high-pitched whistle. That whistle is the sound the Corsair became known for. The center section also held the landing gear wells and 2 hardpoints, each able to carry a bomb of up to 1,000 pounds or a drop tank. On the outer wings, the forward skin was metal back to the main spar. Behind the spar, it was fabric. And on the leading edge of the outer right wing sat that small stall strip, 6 inches of metal just outboard of the gun ports, quietly fixing the uneven stall that had once rolled Corsairs into the sea. The Corsair used a 3-section flap system, 2 panels on the center wing and 1 on each folding section. For landing, the flaps could drop as much as 50 degrees, letting the aircraft fly safely at low speed. For tight maneuvering, they could be set to 20 degrees. But even the refined F4U-4 kept one dangerous habit. That powerful engine and large propeller generated enormous torque, and if a pilot slammed the throttle open, during an aborted landing or an engine problem on takeoff, the aircraft could roll hard to one side. Mishandled, it could dig a wingtip in or roll over entirely. Pilots were trained to be gentle and deliberate with the throttle in exactly the moments when instinct screams to firewall it. In earlier hands, this torque had killed enough novices to earn the aircraft its ensign eliminator name. The F4U-4 was faster and stronger than its predecessors, but it still demanded respect. At the heart of the F4U-4 was the Pratt & Whitney R280018W double WASP, an air-cooled radial with 18 cylinders, arranged as 2 rings of 9, one behind the other, displacing 46 liters. The W in its name is the key to the aircraft. It stands for a water-methanol injection system. Under normal power, the engine was already formidable. But by injecting a water-methanol mix, the pilot could briefly extract far more, a state called wartime emergency power, producing around 2,450 horsepower. The catch was severe, and it is the trade-off that defines the engine. This boost devoured the engine's life. Used even for short bursts, it could burn away what should have been hundreds of hours of service in a matter of minutes. It was a reserve for emergencies, a way to buy a burst of performance at a cost you paid later, if the engine lasted that long. Turning all that power into thrust was a 4-bladed Hamilton standard propeller, 13 feet 2 inches across. Now, the number everyone wants. Top speed. You will very often see the F4U-4 listed at 446 miles per hour. It is worth being precise here, because that figure does not appear in any test report we could find. The Navy's own measured maximum from a 1948 production trial was 443 miles per hour, reached at 29,000 feet on military power. Vaught's own estimate, at full combat power, was higher still, 453. The popular 446 sits between the two and reads like two rows of two different tables spliced together. So the honest figure is this: a measured 443 miles per hour, with the manufacturer estimating up to 453 at emergency power. Either way, it was one of the fastest piston fighters of the war, and it could climb at over 4,300 feet per minute. For all its aggression, the Corsair was built to bring its pilot home. And nothing shows that better than its fuel system. The main tank held 233 US gallons, and crucially, it was self-sealing. The mechanism was elegant. The tank was a two-layer sandwich of rubber compounds inside a metal shell. If a bullet punched through, fuel would contact the rubber, which swelled and closed the wound around the hole. A leak that would have doomed another aircraft simply sealed itself. Compare that to the Zero, which, in the name of lightness, carried no such protection. A single incendiary hit could turn it into a fireball. The Corsair made the opposite bargain. It accepted the weight of armor and a protected tank in exchange for survivability. And that bargain is a large part of why its pilots trusted it. For range, the aircraft could carry drop tanks under the center wing, each holding 150 gallons, together more than the main tank itself. Fuel could be drawn from any tank and could be transferred from the drop tanks into the main tank in flight. On internal fuel alone, the aircraft's range was about 1,156 miles. With drop tanks, that stretched to roughly 1,800. The F4U-4's standard armament was 6 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 3 in each wing. The two outer guns carried 375 rounds each, the inner 400 apiece. They fired between 750 and 850 rounds per minute at a muzzle velocity of 2,900 feet per second, and their bullets remained effective in air combat out to about 900 yards. Pilots typically set their guns to converge somewhere between 300 and 500 yards, tuned to personal preference. There was also a cannon-armed version, carrying 4 20mm cannon in place of the machine guns. A word on that aircraft, because it causes endless confusion. It was designated the F4U-4C, then redesignated the F4U-4B under a 1946 change to Navy naming. The -4B and the -4C are the same aircraft, not two different types. But the Corsair's real menace by this stage was what it slung under its wings. It could carry 8 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, each weighing 134 pounds, with a 7.5-pound warhead, used against lighter ground targets. For hardened targets, it could take bombs of up to 1,000 pounds, or a pair of enormous Tiny Tim rockets, nearly a foot across, each weighing more than 1,200 pounds, effective out to 1,600 yards. Altogether, the aircraft could haul up to 4,000 pounds of external ordnance. A fighter when it needed to be, a bomber when the fleet needed one. That flexibility is the entire point of the machine. The pilot sat behind a windscreen of 1.5-inch bulletproof glass, with an armored backplate up to 1/2 inch thick behind him. Here we can lay another myth to rest. The Corsair's raised seat and bulged canopy, the fix for that poor forward view, were not a feature of the F4U-4. They came in on an earlier mark, back in August 1943. The F4U-4's own cockpit change was quieter. The addition of a proper cockpit floor, with the rudder pedals and control stick pivot raised to suit it. And roughly half of all F4U-4s left the factory still wearing the older, rounded windscreen of the F4U-1D. The layout was clean for its day. The left console held the oxygen controls, the wingfold controls, and the combined engine control unit that grouped the throttle and its neighbors, with the hydraulic hand pump below. Ahead of the pilot were two armament switch boxes for selecting weapons, the main instrument panel with its flight, engine, and fuel gauges, and a Mark 8 reflector gun sight. The control stick carried a gun trigger, a bomb or drop tank release, and a thumb button for rockets. Every weapon the aircraft carried, controlled from one hand. Finally, the landing gear that the whole gull wing was designed around. Thanks to the low wing bend, the legs could be short and strong. On retraction, the main struts folded backward, each wheel rotating 90 degrees to lie flat inside the wing. It was an ingenious solution to a problem the aircraft had created for itself by demanding such a large propeller. We promised earlier to show you what it took to fly this machine. It began before the engine ever turned. The pilot switched on the battery, set the fuel selector to on, and tested his warning lights. He set the booster pump to boost, turned the ignition to both, and started the engine. As it caught, he moved the mixture control from idle cutoff to rich, and let the engine idle at 600 to 800 revolutions per minute until the oil pressure came up. Then, very gently, he eased the throttle forward until the engine reached 1,000 revolutions and the oil warmed. Taxiing was its own art. With that vast engine ahead of him, the pilot had no view directly forward at all. So he swung the aircraft in a series of S-turns, weaving left and right to see around the nose. For takeoff, he opened the canopy and locked it, locked the tail wheel, and set his rudder, elevator, and aileron trim to fight the engine's torque before it could start. Holding the brakes, he fed in power until the tail lifted in the propeller's blast, then let the aircraft accelerate, watching the airspeed climb past 81 miles per hour before easing the stick back and lifting into the air. Gear up, power back, and the Corsair was where it belonged. Before a fight, he armed for it. Gun charging handles moved from safe to charge and pushed once, each handle charging all 3 guns in one wing. Then the master armament switch and the individual gun switches on, the gun sight lit, rockets and bombs readied on their own circuits. Now the aircraft was ready to do what it was built for. And here the legend and the record begin to part ways. Because the F4U-4 arrived at the very end of the war it was designed to win. Production deliveries began in early 1945. By the time the Mark reached combat, the Pacific War had roughly 10 weeks left to run. Its documented air-to-air record in the Second World War is small and specific. 9 victories, every one of them flown by Marine squadrons operating from land in Marine Aircraft Group 14. The last of them fell on the 22nd of June, 1945, the 21st and final kill of the Marine ace Kenneth Walsh, who shot down a kamikaze. Carrier squadrons did take the F4U-4 to sea in the summer of 1945 and flew strikes, including a raid on Wake Island in early August, but they hold no air-to-air credits in the type. So the aircraft built to reclaim the skies over Japan turned up just as the fighting there was ending. In the great air battles that made the Corsair feared, the F4U-4 was barely present. That reputation, the whistle, the dive, the dread, was earned by the earlier marks in 1943 and 1944. The definitive Corsair inherited the legend. Its own war was still 5 years away. When it came, that war was fought over Korea, and it was fought mostly on the ground. By 1950, the jet age had arrived, and in the skies, the Corsair was outclassed by aircraft like the swept-wing MiG-15. But the fleet did not keep flying the F4U-4 to dual jets. It kept flying it because the aircraft was proven, available, already paid for, and could carry a heavy load of ordnance exactly where the ground war needed it. Over a ridgeline, in support of troops in contact, the Corsair was the cheapest way to put real weight of fire on a target. Marine Corsairs alone flew more than 127,000 sorties over Korea. This, not the Pacific, is where the F4U-4 did its hardest and most important work. Its defining moment came in the brutal winter of 1950, during the fighting retreat from the Chosin Reservoir, where thousands of encircled Marines depended on air support to survive. On the 4th of December, a flight of F4U-4s from the carrier Leyte was working over the hills when one aircraft, flown by Ensign Jesse Brown, the Navy's first black naval aviator, was hit by ground fire. The round struck his main fuel line. It is worth pausing on that detail, because it cuts against one of the most durable myths about this aircraft. Brown was not brought down by a severed coolant line, because a Corsair has no coolant line to sever. Its air-cooled radial needs no liquid cooling at all. He was brought down by a hit to his fuel, the same vulnerability any aircraft carries. The engine that supposedly made the Corsair untouchable did not save him. Brown crash-landed in the frozen mountains, trapped in the wreckage. His wingman, Lieutenant Junior Grade Thomas Hudner, made a decision that had no precedent. He deliberately crash-landed his own intact aircraft alongside Brown's, in enemy territory, and tried to free him by hand. He could not. Brown did not survive. Hudner received the Medal of Honor, his citation recording a deliberate wheels-up landing in the presence of enemy troops. It remains one of the most extraordinary acts of loyalty in the history of naval aviation. And it happened in an F4U-4. The Corsair even, occasionally, reached back into the fight it was supposedly too old for. On the 10th of September 1952, Captain Jesse Fulmar, flying a cannon-armed F4U-4B, was jumped by MiG-15 jets. He turned into them and shot one down, a piston-engine fighter, destroying a modern jet. Minutes later, the other MiGs shot him down in turn. He survived. The exchange captures the aircraft's whole Korean career. Outmatched in the air, dangerous anyway, and never quite out of the fight. For all of that, this was not a flawless machine, and it is worth being honest about what it cost to fly. It was still, in a novice's hands, a dangerous aircraft. The torque that earned it the Ensign Eliminator name never fully went away. On the ground and on landing, the long nose left the pilot blind ahead, forcing those constant weaving turns. The emergency power that gave the engine its punch quietly consumed the engine's life. And in the ground attack role it spent most of its career in, it was far more exposed than the legend allows. That last point deserves care, because it is where the myth is strongest. The idea that the Corsair's air-cooled radial let it shrug off ground fire that would have downed a liquid-cooled fighter like the P-51 Mustang is intuitive and widely repeated. And where it has actually been studied, it does not hold up. One scholarly assessment found the Corsair's oil cooling and engine protection left it just as susceptible as the Mustang to ground fire, and later survivability analysis has pointed straight at its exposed wing oil coolers as a Korea-era weakness. Jesse Brown's loss to a fuel line hit is not an exception to the rule. It is the rule. The Corsair survived over Korea by being useful and available, not by being invulnerable. The F4U-4 sat near the end of a long line. The original F4U-1 gave way to improved -1A and -1D models through the war. The F4U-4 was the great re-engining that reclaimed climb, altitude, and speed, and fitted the four-bladed propeller, the version that pulled the most out of the airframe. After it came the F4U-5, further refined, which produced a specialized night fighter and soldiered on into the 1950s. It was an F4U-5 night fighter, not a -4, that carried the Navy's only all-propeller ace of the Korean War. And it was an F4U-5, not a -4, that fought the last piston fighter dogfight in history during a brief 1969 war in Central America. Keeping those marks straight matters, because almost every famous Corsair story gets attached to the wrong one. So let us settle the account between the legend and the record. Because both are real, and they are not the same thing. The fear was genuine. The Corsair was one of the fastest, strongest, best-armed piston fighters ever flown, and enemy troops did learn to dread the whistle of its dive. But the specific legends attached to it deserve honest handling. The famous top speed of 446 miles per hour appears in no test document. The measured figure is 443. The celebrated 11-to-1 kill ratio comes from the Navy's own 1946 statistics. 2,140 claimed victories against 189 Corsairs lost to enemy aircraft. But those are unaudited squadron claims for the entire Corsair line, not this mark. Counted against every cause of loss, the ratio falls closer to 1 1/3 to 1. And the name itself, Whistling Death. It first appears not in any Japanese record, but in the American press, in a 1943 issue of Time magazine, which asserted the Japanese had coined it while naming no source. No Japanese wartime source using the phrase has ever been found. Japanese airmen appear to have called the aircraft simply Sikorsky, after the company that first built it. If you have seen such a source, we would genuinely like to know. Let us know in the comments. Strip away the embroidery, and what remains is arguably more impressive than the myth. The F4U-4 was the perfected form of a genuinely great aircraft. It arrived too late to add much to the Corsair's Second World War legend, and it did its hardest fighting 5 years later, as the workhorse that held the line over Korea when the fleet needed heavy ordnance over a ridgeline and a pilot willing to fly low to deliver it. The Corsair remained in production from 1942 to 1953, the longest production run of any American piston engine fighter, flying well into the jet age. And it proved something that would echo forward to the A-1 Sky Raider over Vietnam, that a rugged, heavily armed propeller attack aircraft could outlive the very jets that were supposed to replace it. Was its reputation deserved? The fear was earned. The legend was polished. And the real aircraft, told straight, is the better story. If you want to see the other side of this fight, the light, lethal fighter the Corsair was built to defeat, take a look at our video on the Mitsubishi Zero. If you spotted any errors, please let us know in the comments. We are always looking to improve, and on an aircraft this tangled in legend, we mean it. If you would like to support work like this, you can find us on Patreon. Thank you for watching.